On the last episode of the Keepsake box, I watched Mandy and Tina closely. Tina only had a water, citing that she was the group's designated driver. Mandy had a tropical drink with a cute little umbrella inserted into the glass. I mimicked the way Mandy sipped her drink. She looked sophisticated, and I hoped I looked the same way. I thought about how Cream and Peaches used to take shots of liquor. No mixers, no chasers. I wondered if that activity would be frowned upon in my newfound setting. Would the legal group find it to be ghetto? I hadn't ever given Peaches and Cream's antics a second thought. Their behavior was quite hilarious and also normal. But I realized the difference when in different company. I also noticed the difference in how my normal circle of women acted and how Mandy and Tina acted, specifically as it related to their relationships. I behaved in contrast as well. No one could ever say that I was an angry black woman. I didn't portray myself that way, but I was certainly different than Mandy and Tina. It was subtle, but simultaneously obvious. I had a quick retort. I responded quickly to anything that was presented to me. In my previous circle, we called it the snapback. The snapback occurred when someone said something and was met with a witty comeback from the other party. The snapback was specifically designed to out-retort the original speaker. It was usually funny and caused a little sting, but that was the point, the sting. In my case, I would be presented with an adverse comment. Typically, either Cream or Peaches would say, "Oh, she about to snap back." That's why it was called the snapback. It was a common occurrence for me to snap back at Antonio, but he loved it. He always told me that he loved my spunk. Antonio never got upset about me snapping back. He usually say, "Shut up with your smart mouth." Sometime he'd say, "Okay, pipe down, little girl." We'd laugh about it. I couldn't imagine the legal group laughing about the snapback. Mandy and Tina were different. They responded differently. They were softer, less confrontational. Now, understand this. Present day, I'm fully aware that the phenomenon that I experienced had nothing to do with race. I was placed in a controlled situation. Mandy and Tina were so for a reason. Their behavior was so for a reason. There were clear-cut expectations placed upon them, but at the time, I wasn't aware of that fact. I saw the validation that they gave to their men. I saw how they allowed them to lead in every area. The men dominated the conversation. The women were mere accessories. I admit to being trapped in a race box. In my mind, white women were demure. That's what I had been raised to believe. I thought that they were easily talked down because they were white. That couldn't have been further from the truth. I now know that they were quiet because they were controlled. They were puppets. In spite of it all, I found that I enjoyed the company of the legal group. Though initially apprehensive, 1 hour turned into 3. The other couples left, and David and I sat for a moment. We talked and joked around a little, and things became more comfortable. David asked if I wanted another drink. I declined, citing that I had to drive home. I remember that very clearly. However, I do not remember much else. Chapter 5. The Signs Were There. Narrated by Shandora Warren. I awoke the next morning with a monstrous headache. I was in an unfamiliar room and everything was spinning around me. I was extremely nauseated and thirsty. Where was I? I certainly wasn't at home. I could easily have been at a hotel or maybe a fancy bed and breakfast. The room was beautiful and very comfortable, but I was concerned about the fact that I couldn't pinpoint where I was or how I had gotten there. I stepped onto the floor. I realized that my legs were incredibly shaky. Though horribly wrinkled, my clothes were completely intact. My shoes and purse were neatly placed on a chair to my left. I looked to my right and spotted a nightstand. Placed atop was an alarm clock. It was 11:37, and based on the sunlight peering through the window, I knew that it was nearly noon. I had slept until nearly 12 o'clock in that unfamiliar place. On the same nightstand were 2 pills and a bottle of water. I assumed that both were for me, and I certainly needed them. My head was throbbing. But due to the events that had taken place with Ken, I refused to take unidentified pills, and justifiably so. I walked through a series of hallways before arriving at a beautifully furnished living room. I looked around for anything that would give me a clue as to where I was. I found nothing. The room was completely nondescript, with no pictures or distinguishing characteristics. It had lots of modern architectural design and exquisite furnishings. It was beautiful, yet uninviting. It lacked the personality that you would expect of a personal residence. I heard the familiar sound of a sliding glass door. It was David, returning from an exterior space. He smiled as he entered and held up a half-smoked cigar. "Guilty pleasure," he said. The smoking of the cigar wasn't even on my list of concerns. I needed to know why I was there. "What happened?" I asked. David chuckled. "The best top-shelf martini in the city," he said. I was legitimately confused. I only had one martini and felt perfectly fine after drinking it. David laughed when I expressed my confusion. He told me that I'd actually had 4. 4? How did I not remember that? David went on to tell me that after the legal group left, I decided to have another drink at his request. According to David, 2 martinis had turned into 4. I was confused. I specifically remembered declining David's offer to have another drink. It wasn't like me to bend so easily, specifically not at the request of someone who was basically a stranger. I thought about the situation for a moment. It crossed my mind that I may have been drugged, but I quickly dismissed that thought. There really didn't seem to be a legitimate motive. And here's my rationale. I knew for a fact that I had been drugged before. Ken had obviously drugged me against my will, and I could pinpoint why. Ken had put me to sleep so he could carry out his plan without intervention. He knew that I would object to him attacking Ron, and he needed me to be out of the way. Additionally, he absolved me of any responsibility by carrying out his plan without my knowledge. That made sense to me. But that morning, I'd awakened at David's, fully clothed, in what was obviously a spare bedroom. I hadn't been raped or robbed. So what motive would David have had to drug me? I really couldn't find one. I dismissed my feelings and accepted the fact that I'd had too much to drink. David asked if I wanted something to eat. I declined, of course. We were much too early in the dating process for him to see my morning look. I hadn't even brushed my teeth, and I felt extremely uncomfortable. "I guess you'd like to go to your car now," he asked. I responded, "Very much so." David and I made the short 5-minute drive to the bar. I realized why he was a regular there. He was practically within walking distance. David pulled into the parking lot and parked directly beside my car. Without ever having asked, David knew which car was mine. Something about that troubled me. "How did you know that this was my car?" I asked. David replied that he recognized my car because he had been following me. He told me that he had taken the opportunity to rummage through my car while I was asleep. I was more than certain that the shock showed on my face. I wanted to go off on him, and I had every intention of doing so. David laughed before I was able to verbally annihilate him. "I'm kidding," he said. I watched as his eyes scanned down. "Your keys," he said. I looked down at my keys, which were placed on my lap. As clear as day, the Jaguar emblem was prominently displayed. There were very few cars parked in the lot, only one of which was a Jaguar. Mine. David and I both laughed. I put his ability to be observant into my mental Rolodex. If you haven't noticed, I like that. When I really thought about it, the whole thing sounded ridiculous. In less than an hour, I had considered and dismissed the possibilities that David had followed me, drugged me, and gone through my belongings. I would later learn that he had done all 3. But on that day, I had no reason to dig deeply into those thoughts. They didn't fit my mental narrative at the time. I got into my car, promising myself that I wouldn't ever drink again. I don't have to tell you that I didn't keep that promise. After that day, I didn't hear from David for 3 weeks. While I hadn't given a second thought the first time, I was very bothered by his second disappearance. Now, if you've been paying attention, you realize that I had no real reason to be interested in David. The date was a dud, to say the least. From the beginning, I didn't feel that I belonged in that setting. I was aware that I was different. I looked different. I dressed differently. I behaved differently. Initially, that made me uncomfortable. David changed my name when he introduced me. I can only assume that his decision to do so was based on the fact that Shelonda sounded a little too ethnic for the legal group. That made me uncomfortable. I spent more time talking to his friends than to him. That didn't make me uncomfortable, but I found it odd. I woke up in a strange house with the thought that I may have been drugged. That made me uncomfortable. David inappropriately joked about following me and going through my belongings. I considered the fact that he may have done so. That certainly made me uncomfortable. There were several things that occurred that made me uncomfortable, justifiably so. So with all things considered, why was I so bothered that I hadn't heard from David? It boiled down to one simple thing: rejection. I hated the feeling of being rejected. And it wasn't just the feeling of rejection. It was also the understanding that I may have contributed to David's decision to no longer maintain contact. I thought about the situation quite a bit. Maybe my choice of attire was offsetting. Maybe I came across a little more ghetto than I thought. Maybe Shelley wasn't as accepted as I believed her to be. Maybe I didn't display the softness of Tina and Mandy. Maybe my inability to hold my liquor was problematic for David. I replayed each scenario and they all bothered me. I hated the feeling that I could have done something that would have created a more favorable outcome. That has always been a problem for me. But 2 weeks later, David called. I answered the phone in the same manner as always. Hello? Again, David acted as if we had just encountered each other earlier in the day. Hi, it's David. Of course, I responded. Hi, David, it's Shelonda. David chuckled and continued the conversation. So, are you coming out to the bar on Friday? I was legitimately shocked and confused. I hadn't heard from David in 2 weeks. Yet, he addressed me as if we had a standing, reserved date night. I paused momentarily to collect my thoughts. I told David that the last episode had led me to believe that drinking probably wasn't for me. He chuckled lightly. You'll be fine, he said. You just have to pace yourself. David told me that he would take it easier on me the next time. So I agreed to meet the legal group for drinks on Friday and many other Fridays afterwards. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shinny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.